Auzu billahi minash shaitanir rajim. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Welcome back once again to my YouTube channel, Umair Ahmad Khan. Today, the topic is very important and it is Piaget's theory of cognitive development. That how the psychology of a human mind it develops and how the child he nourishes and how the child he learns different things in his life and how the child he starts perceiving, understanding different things. We are going to talk about these things in this video. And what points specifically we will be talking about? We'll be talking about general principles of of development. We'll be talking about Piaget's theory. We will be talking about influences on development, basic tendencies in thinking, and four stages of cognitive development. Okay, how this? Let's get started. General disciplines of development. People develop at different rates. In your own classroom, you'll have a whole range of examples of different developmental rates. Some students will be larger, better coordinated, or more mature in their thinking and social relationships. Others will be much slower to mature in these areas. Except in rare cases of very rapid or very slow development, such differences are normal and should be expected in any large group of students. Okay, the development of different people it takes place at different rates. I mean, some people in your surrounding, some people in your environment, some people in your classroom, if you're a teacher, would be more intelligent, would be more active, would be more dynamic, would be more bold, but some students would be a bit lazy or would be passive learners. But these things and these differences are normal when you're talking about large group of students. Okay, the second point, development is relatively orderly. It shortly means it means that development it takes place in a proper order, in a proper sequence. For example, people develop abilities in a logical order. In infancy, they sit before they walk, they babble before they talk, and they see the world through their own eyes before they can begin to imagine how others see it. Just imagine how wonderfully the example is being given that people, when a kid is an infant, he, crawls and he sits before he walks and he babbles, ba, 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 ba. He babbles before he talks, and similarly, he observes with his own eyes. I mean, before, perceiving how other perceive and how other understand things differently. Before this process it gets started, the child he observes and he learns from his own experiences. Okay, in school they will master addition before algebra, Harry Potter before Shakespeare, and so on. But orderly does not necessarily mean linear or predictable. People might advance, stay the same for a period of time, or even go backward. Okay, the last principle is development takes place gradually. It's a slow process. Very rarely do changes appear overnight. And you might have heard this probably in idiom that a watch pot never boils. A student who cannot manipulate a pencil or answer a hypothetical question may well develop this ability, but the change is likely to take time. Of course, change it takes time. A student, or a kid who is at a very young age, or he's just in his infancy, or maybe he's developing his, cognitive skills. So how is it possible that he may be answering the questions, where is God, who is God, and what is truth and what is lie, what is darkness, what is light? So he wouldn't be able to answer these hypothetical questions until he develops his own psychology, until he develops his own mentality, until he develops and he learns different things, how things are happening in his life, and how this will he'll be able to answer these questions when he gets an experience and when he is knowledgeable about certain things. Okay, the next point is uh, we have talked about this. Okay, who is Piaget in fact? He is a Swiss psychologist. His complete or name is Jean Piaget. He was a real prodigy. In fact, in his teens, he published so many scientific papers on mollusks, marine animals such as oysters, clams, octopuses, snails, and squid. He was offered a job as a curator of the mollusk collection in the Museum of Natural History in Geneva. He told the museum officials that he wanted to finish high school first. For a while, Piaget worked in Alfred Binet's laboratory in Paris, developing intelligence tests for children. The reason children gave for their wrong answers fascinated him, and this prompted him to study the thinking behind the answers. The question intrigued him for the rest of the life of his life. Okay, he continued to write until his death at the age of 84. So Piaget, he was in fact Swiss psychologist, and he was one of those intelligent people, those who started at, earlier at their life to publish the content manuscripts. And then he was also intelligent, and he was working in the natural history in Geneva Museum in Natural History in Geneva, and then he also, started researching on different children's, where when he got to know that the children they answered wrong answers deliberately, so therefore he thought that why not to conduct another exercise, another research to get to know why people they lie. Okay, Piaget's theory. During his long career, Piaget devised a model describing how humans go about making sense of their world by gathering and organizing information. Piaget, he got to know he got to know that during his long career, Piaget devised a model describing how humans go about making sense, how people they make their own sense by gathering information and by gathering knowledge. Okay, we'll examine Piaget's ideology closely because they provide an explanation of the development of thinking from infancy to adulthood. Now, in the coming slides, we'll be able to talk about the cognitive development of humans, how human he develops his psychology from birth to an adulthood. Okay, let's begin. According to Piaget, in 1954, certain ways of thinking that are quite simple for an adult, such as Pittsburgh question and stop and think, are not so simple for a child. For example, do you remember the 9-year-old child at the beginning of the chapter who was asked if he could be a Genevan? He answered, "No, that's not possible. I am already Swiss." Just imagine that the example, it tells you that the student or the kid who is very young or who is just 9 year old, he cannot answer you this question that either he is a Genevan or either he is a Swiss, because he knows that he is a Swiss because that Swiss is his nationality, so he doesn't know, or he cannot rephrase it, or he cannot perceive it that he is Genevan. So he said that no, I cannot be Genevan. Okay, imagine teaching the student geography. The student has trouble with classifying the one concept as a subset of another. Okay, there are other differences between adult and child thinking. Children concepts of time may be different from your own. They may think, for example, they will someday catch up to a sibling in age, or they may confuse the past and the future. Let's examine why. The concept of child in student's mind is totally different. Student might be perceiving time in different with, or they may associate time with different events. For example, they may be thinking that on Eid occasion this was happened, on birthday this was happened, on somebody's marriage this happened. So they associate time with different events. Okay, influences on development. Cognitive development is much more than the addition of a new facts and ideas to an existing store of information. Okay, according to Piaget, our thinking processes uh, processes change radically, though slowly from birth to maturity, because we constantly strive to make sense of the world. So here in this point, in this point, we have to understand that how we get change our thinking radically, but though it is a slow process, but we need to understand. Piaget identified four factors. Piaget identified four factors. Uh, Biological. I mean, these four factors they happen to change our mentality, or they involve in our development. The very first is social development, is biological maturation, that we biologically get mature with the passage of time. We get mature, biologically mature. I mean, with as the age it changes, our thinking, our different body parts, our organs, they get changed, and they get uh, enlarged. Activity, I mean, social our development, it also depends on the activity level, how active we are, how we are involving in a different kind of activities. And again, social experiences, how you interact with society, it is also important. Okay, then is equilibration. The interact to influence changes in thinking. Let's examine briefly the first three factors. We'll turn to a discussion on of equilibration in the next section. Okay, one of the most important influences of the way we make sense of the world is maturation, the unfolding of the biological changes that are genetically programmed. Parents and teachers have little impact on this aspect of cognitive development, except to be sure that children get the nourishment and care they do and they need to be healthy. Activity is another influence. With physical maturation comes the increasing ability to act on the environment and learn from it. When a young child's coordination is reasonably developed, for example, the child can discover principles about balance by experimenting with a seesaw. Thus, as we act on the environment, as we explore, as we explore, and then we have to test, observe, and eventually organize the information, we are likely to alter our thinking process at the same time. Okay, next concept is, as we develop as we develop, we are also interacting with the people around us. According to Piaget, our cognitive development is influenced by social transmission or learning from others. Basic tendencies in thinking. As a result of his early research in biology, Piaget concluded that all species inherit two basic tendencies or invariant functions. The first of these tendencies toward organization, the combining, the arranging, the recombining, and rearranging of behaviors and thoughts into coherent systems. The second tendency is toward adaptation or adjusting to the environment. Okay, what is in fact organization? What is in fact organization? People are born with a tendency to organize their thinking process into a psychological structures. These psychological structures are systems for understanding and interacting with the world. Simple structures are continually combined and coordinated to become more sophisticated and thus more effective. Very young infants, for example, can either look at or an object or grasp it. When it comes to contact with their hands, they cannot coordinate looking and grasping at the same time. As they develop, how infants organize these two separate behavioral structures into a coordinated higher level structure of looking, reaching for, and grasping the object. They can, of course, still use each structure separately. Okay, the children, they get psychological structures, the something in their mind when they touch something, they get to know the meaning, they get to know the associated feeling, they get to know different things when they get into contact. Piaget gave a special name to these structures, schemas. Okay, schemas means something. For example, you plan to give your, you have an exam and you just plan to appear in the paper, so definitely you'll be thinking that how these things will go are going to happen, these things are going to happen, and how you will be given your paper. So you just plan things, you keep on thinking that how or what things will be required. And now this thinking process, or whatever the structures that are coming in your mind and making a shape, that is called schemas. In this theory, schemas are basic building blocks of thinking. They are organized systems of actions or thought that allow us to mentally represent or think about the objects or events in our world. Schemas can be very small and specific, for example, cycling through a store scheme or the recognizing a row scheme. Okay. Organization, or they can be larger and more general. For example, the drinking scheme of the gardening scheme. As a person's thinking process becomes more organized and new schemes develop, behavior also becomes more sophisticated and better suited by the environment. Okay, the next concept is adaptation. In adaptation, we have again different concepts. In addition to the tendency to organize psychological structures, people also inherit the tendency to adapt to their environment. Two basic processes are involved in adaptation: assimilation and accommodation. Very important. Assimilation takes place when we use our existing schemas. Schemas, I believe that you have understood the structures that are, making in our mind when we are thinking about anything. I mean, for example, if you I'm just giving you an example again. If you want to start your business, you definitely are going to plan something. Oh, I mean, that planning, whatever is coming in your mind, that is called schemas. Okay, to make these events, or in our word, assimilation involves trying to understand something new by fitting it into what we already know. At times, we may have to distort the new information to make it fit. For example, the first time many children see a raccoon, they call it a kitty. They try to match with the new experience with the existing schema for identifying animals. Now, imagine that you cannot you cannot think about any other thing, you cannot make speculation, you cannot have any other words in your mind until, for example, raccoon, if you have never heard this word before in your life, so you cannot assimilate, you cannot compare, you cannot link, you cannot connect with the existing knowledge that you have in your mind, because you do not have any other thing in your mind. So a new word will always be a new until you just research it. When you just research it, you get to know the meaning of raccoon. You just compare it with a kitty, you just compare it with, because okay, raccoon is like an animal that, I mean, really is similar to a cat, or maybe kitten, or maybe kitty. Okay, this is how you get to assimilate the information that you already know. Accommodation occurs when we must change existing schemas to respond to a new situation. Accommodation is like this: you just accept raccoon as a raccoon, you don't compare it with a kitty. Existing or accepting new knowledge as new is called accommodation. If we cannot make new data fit any existing schemas, then we must develop our appropriate structures. We adjust our thinking to fit the new information instead of adjusting the information to fit our thinking. Children demonstrate accommodation when they add the scheme for recognition raccoon to their old systems for identifying animals. Okay, adaptation. People adapt to their increasingly complex environment by using existing schemas. Whenever these schemas work, assimilation by modifying and adding to their schemes when something new is added is needed. Okay, in fact, both processes are required most of time. Even using an established pattern such as sucking through a straw requires some accommodation. If the straw is of a different size of length, than the type you are used to. If you have tried drinking juice from the box packages, you know that you have to then the type you add a new skill to your sucking through a straw scheme. Don't squeeze the box or you will shoot juice through the straw straight up into the air into your lap. Whenever new experiences are assimilated into the existing scheme, the scheme is enlarged and changed somewhat. So assimilation involves some accommodation. There are also times when neither assimilation nor accommodation is used. If people encounter something that is too unfamiliar, they may ignore it. Experience is filtered to fit the kind of thinking a person is doing at a given time. For example, if you over if you overhear a conversation in a foreign language, you probably will not try to make sense of the exchange unless you have some knowledge of the language. Okay, so this was the thing, and now equilibration. According to Piaget, organizing, assimilating, and accommodating can be viewed as a kind of complex balancing act. In his theory, the actual changes in thinking take place through the process of equilibration, the act of searching for a balance. And similarly, Piaget assumed that the people continually test the adequacy of their thinking process in order to achieve their balance. Briefly, the process of equilibration works like this: if we apply a particular scheme to an event or situation and the scheme works, then equilibration exists. If the scheme doesn't produce a satisfying result, then disequilibrium exists and we become uncomfortable. This motivates us to keep searching for a solution through assimilation and accommodation, and thus our thinking changes and moves ahead. Of course, the level of disequilibrium must be just right or optimal. Too little, we aren't interested in changing; too much, and we must maybe discourage or anxious and not change. The social sources of individual thinking. For example, the children first use in activities with others to regulate. First, use language in activities with others to regulate the behavior of others. No nap. Oh, I want a cookie. Later, however, the child can regulate her own behavior using private speech. For example, careful, don't smell. As you'll see in the later section, so far Vygotsky, social interaction was more than influence. It was the origin of our mental process such as problem solving. Consider this example: a 6-year-old has lost a toy and asks her father for help. The father asks her where she last saw the toy. The child says, I can't remember. He asks a series of questions. Did you have it in a room? Outside? Next door? To each question, the child answers no. When he says in the car, she says, I think so, and goes to retrieve the toy. This is how the child, he recalls things in different social resources. Now, the last slide and the second last, the four stages of cognitive development. Now we turn to actual differences that Piaget hypothesized that for children as they grow. Piaget believed that all people pass through the same four stages in exactly the same order. The stages are generally associated with specific ages, not but these are general guidelines, not labels for all children of a certain age. Piaget noted that individuals may go through long periods of transition between stages and that a person may show characteristics of one stage in one situation, but traits of a higher or a lower stage in other situations. Therefore, remember that knowing a student's age is never a guarantee you will know how that child thinks. Infancy, the sensory motor state, the earliest period is called the sensory motor. Okay, now the first stage is called sensory motor, and it begins from infancy to 2 years. in this, what are the characteristics of this stage? The child, he learns through reflexes, senses and movements, actions and on the environment. He begins to imitate others and remember events, shifts to symbolic thinking, comes to understand that objects do not cease to exist when they are out of sight. Object permanence moves from reflexive actions to intentional activity. Again, pre-operational is the next stage. It begins about the time when the child starts talking to about 3 years. 3 years to 7 years, it remains in this stage. The child, he develops language and begins to use symbols to represent objects. He has a difficulty with the past and the future. He thinks in the present, can think through operations logically in one direction, has difficulties in understanding the point of view of another person. And then concrete operational stages, it begins about first grade to early adolescence, around 11 years. And in this state, can the child can think logically about concrete hands-on problem and understand conservation, and organizes things into categories and in series, can reverse thinking to mentally undo actions, understand past, present, and future. Formal operations, adolescence to adulthood, can think hypothetically and deductively. Thinking becomes more scientific, solves abstract problems in logical fashion, can consider multiple perspectives and develop concerns about social issues, personal identity, and justice. Sensory motor stage. Let me give you example of each. Sensory motor stage is a stage where child, he learns through the reflexes and actions. When you touch your baby, the child, he considers the particular action, that what this particular touching means. And when you just kiss your baby, he understands this action, that the person is just loving. And in the second stage, we can have an example that when you just talk to your the child, he thinks in only one direction. He only knows that the person, they live. He doesn't understand that the person, they also die and they go back to their eternal word as well. Okay, now the third stage, can think logically. Now the child at this stage is able to understand, and he is able to undo actions. He is able to apologize. He is able to think about hypothetical questions as well, and he is able to understand present, past, and future. And he can, in the last stage, the child is able to think hypothetically and deductively. He can, you know he can generalize thing as well, and then he can come from general to specific as well. That's all for today. Thank you so very much for listening attentively. God bless you, and I hope if you have enjoyed the video, please like it and subscribe it. Thank you. Hopefully we'll meet you in the next video. Thank you. Jazakallah.